Hi. Actually, my field is, more broadly speaking, international politics. And the fall course is going to be 3 sessions on the U.S. elections, the U.S. in the broader context, the candidates' positions on international affairs, and then a post-election analysis. So I'm going to try hard not to speak too much about U.S. politics today, although all of this involves the U.S. as well. I'll say a few things, but I'm going to, the details and so forth, I'll get to in the fall. It's a mess, you've noticed. And number one. And number two, if you came slightly depressed, you're going to leave even more depressed because the mess is, I think, even worse than we imagined. And it's, of course, I'm going to talk about Brexit in England in a few minutes, but let me say some broader things. I think this is more cataclysmic and more serious than the end of the Cold War, because the Cold War actually. I'm gonna record you. Okay. The Cold War actually didn't change things vastly for Western industrial countries. It changed it, of course, for East Europe. And it really didn't change, the nuclear dynamic. Everybody still has nuclear weapons. This is the biggest, potentially, sea change since the Second World War. It has echoes of the 1920s attached to it, and it is fundamentally serious. We live in a world which is full, in the industrial world, but also in the non-industrial world, that is full of people who have grievances. And the grievances of it are varied from country to country and part of the world. In many ways, these are chickens coming home to roost. They're chickens coming home to roost in the late developing world, so-called third world, in terms of what colonialism left and what didn't happen after colonialism. It is chickens coming home to roost in terms of the mismanagement of Europe, Western Europe, also East Europe, and the United States. Globalization has been a good thing, as we all know, but as we also know, it has left people behind. And the people who were left behind could have had their situations remedied if you had had governments which attended to that. So it is not the case that nothing could have been done. It's simply that most of the Western countries followed policies of austerity, and the austerity led to the fact that the infrastructure for people, education, health, putting a floor underneath their income if they became unemployed, retraining them, and so forth. None of this took place, or very little of it took place. And in addition, because of globalization, but also because of modernization or the post-industrial period of time, people had more and have more intellectual ability to tune in to almost everybody in the world and to know what's going on everywhere. It used to be that if you lived in Nigeria or Cambodia, you might occasionally see a Western movie and see how Westerners live, but now on a daily basis you can see how everybody lives, what the situation is, and so forth. You can also tell that if you're left behind, that many people aren't left behind, and that both in your country and between states, some people seem to do very well. I mean, people don't, in third world countries or unemployed people in industrial countries, don't wake up in the morning and say to themselves, 65 people in the world have more assets than half the human population. That statistic is not at the forefront of people's minds, but it is a real statistic, and it has an impact on how people see themselves and see others. The other thing is it's easy to mobilize nowadays in a way that used to not be. I mean, you could mobilize in your city or in your country, but now you can mobilize across national boundaries. That's no one's political fault. That's just a description of the 21st century. And in point of fact, the governments of the world, even the most industrial countries, have not really adjusted their politics and institutions to the 21st century. But people's lives have gotten adjusted to life in the 21st century. And so people are responding to that. In general, you don't have to scratch very far for people to say they are hostile and angry at people who are experts. They're hostile and angry towards bureaucrats, whether they're national or international bureaucrats, and they're even hostile to the press, right? So the consequence of all of that is that there's no one that anybody particularly wants to listen to. People just want to listen to somebody who's got a fix, and a simple fix, and who's going to change things. That is the impetus for the Brexit vote. It's also the impetus, even though I said I'm not going to get into, for Trump. Because after all, the majority of non-university educated, white, working class Americans say they're going to vote for Trump. And if indeed that's the case, Trump could very well win. Right, because of industrials. It is possible. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's not difficult to have a scenario for Trump to win. And that's because the Democrats have lost the democratic base of blue-collar workers in this country, and in England, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have lost people in small towns, in non-urban areas, in areas that haven't benefited from the situation. In addition, the post-World War II world, but even before that, built whole bunches of international institutions which were supposed to make things better. And I'd be happy to give you a long sermon on it has in fact made things better. But if you got to blame somebody, you might as well blame institutions that you don't even understand what in the world they do. It might have come to your notice that after the Brexit vote, the most Googled item on the internet in England was EU, because the people who voted for Brexit basically had no clue what the EU does, right? And now they're walking around saying the EU is anti-democratic. In point of fact, the EU is quite democratic. It has layers of the equivalent of our upper house and our lower house, and people get elected, and people get named by their governments, and so forth and so on. But the idea is there are these faceless bureaucrats, and they're making things worse for us. So it's very serious, and it's very pervasive, and it's pervasive, as I said, in the US as well, but it's also pervasive in other European countries, which all now have a right wing, and the right wing is gaining momentum. Marie Le Pen in France gets, at this moment, 20% of the vote. She could very well become the next prime minister because she's playing on this as well. And the final sort of big elephant in the room is immigration and refugees. It used to be incredibly difficult to move from one part of the world to another, although the whole history of the United States is people having done that, as a matter of fact. But the people that are moving nowadays look different. They have a different religion. They have, different backgrounds. Many those that are actually refugees, as compared to simply migrants who go somewhere else to work. Those people have serious problems, educational deficits, psychological problems from having come from war-torn countries. There are all kinds of issues which make the current wave of migrants, and especially the refugee groups, very disturbing to people. We in the U.S. complain about all of this as well, and it's a big Trump factor. But, we've admitted, 2,500 Syrian refugees as compared to, 500,000 here, 500,000 there in other countries. If the United States were to accept as many refugees and migrants and so forth as, let's say, Sweden, we would have to admit 5 million people. And you can't even imagine us, doing this, or the politics of the U.S. allowing. I mean, we could do it in terms of space and so forth. So immigration is the mass of immigration, as well as the different kinds of people that are immigrating, is also another elephant in the room, which informs all European countries right now, which are scared to death. And one might say that this is again a failure of governments, including the American government, because of course one of the things to do is to create policies and situations which make things better where people are, in which case they're not going to move. Now, I know I'm jumping around, but I just want to say that since Trump is railing against NAFTA, whatever one wants to think about NAFTA, we can discuss that in the fall. The fact of the matter is that NAFTA has helped Mexico economically. The consequence of it is that not that many Mexicans are coming across the border anymore, and many Mexicans who came to the U.S. are returning because their situation in Mexico is better. It's a good illustration to show that if you do something to help the people on the ground, most people don't want to leave their countries and their languages and their families and so forth. So again, it is a failure of both individual countries and collective countries to have addressed this issue in a way that is long-term and permanent, and finding themselves in the middle of this soup of immigration. It is also, while I'm talking about immigration, it is also the case that, for example, in England, which I'll get to, I promise, in a minute, but England has to be seen in the larger context, or UK, that the people that all the European countries, including the UK, do not integrate people and make them nationals. You can be second generation from somewhere in the UK or in Germany or wherever, and people still refer to you as a Turk or a Pakistani or whatever, right? And the illustration that some of you who are friends in this room have heard me say many times, when you go in an English bus and the population is varied from various parts of the world, an English person, even a very liberal and lefty English person, will say, there's not a single English person on this bus, right? What we would say is that there's not a single white person on this bus, or there's not a single English-speaking person on this bus, because we simply don't know whether people are citizens or not, and we imagine that they could be, right, and that they would be. So from an American perspective, it's difficult to understand how alienating these foreigners are in those societies, because they can't imagine them becoming English or German or whatever, or French, really. And in the US, we can imagine them. We don't necessarily, we don't necessarily want, large globs of people, but we can imagine it. And because we can imagine it, our politics are split between the people who can imagine it and the people who are, for example, the Trump supporters, who are saying, we're beginning to look different. But we don't have to go very much back in American history. I grew up in New York City in the 1950s, where people were railing against Irish and Italians, right? And where people were saying about the university CCNY, it's all been taken over by Jewish people. There aren't any non-Jewish people in CCNY. Nowadays, we say there aren't any non-Asian people at the university, right? So much of this has been seen before, but from an American perspective, it's useful to recognize that in many ways we overlap these problems that are going on in Europe, but we also have a slightly different history. Okay, we can get back to all of this, but let's talk about the UK. So, the UK voted for Brexit. As you've heard, endlessly 17 million people voted for it. What were they voting for? They have no idea. They weren't voting for anything. They were voting against something. Yeah. Right? We need to bear that in mind. They were voting against something. What were they voting against? Unemployment, foreigners coming into their communities, schools getting worse. English schools used to be good. Hospitals that don't admit people, not because their health system didn't work, but because it's impacted by too many new people in their town and in their village. Why did the services that the government provides erode so in northern England and these working class towns? Because the conservative government had an austerity policy, just like in this country, ironically, the mainstream Republicans have that austerity policy, right? The mainstream Republicans are saying right now, if we got rid of Trump, we would have small government and more austerity and fewer taxes and so forth. That was the conservative line in England. So the people not only found themselves squeezed by globalization, but they also found themselves squeezed by the malfunctions in their own society, which serviced the rich people, but not the poor people. Housing got more expensive, everything got more expensive. Now, because they're not necessarily well tuned to the causes of it, some of them actually argued that the cause was not their own government, even if they voted against the conservative government, but the cause was the EU. Why was the cause of the EU? Because of false information that was given by Mr. Johnson, who, by the way, has now decided not to run. That, as of this morning, if you haven't turned on the news yet this morning, there's news about that. Because those folks on the Brexit side, especially Mr. Farage, who is the extreme right-wing, UKIP, racist, whatnot individual, they put out figures, $350 gazillion are being paid by us, the poor, unemployed, Northern English, to the EU. To begin with, that's not true. That is to say, the English contribution to the EU is considerably lower. But in point of fact, the transfer of EU money into the poor cities and towns in England has been rather large. So insofar as those people didn't suffer even more than they're suffering, it's because not of their national government, but because of the EU, right? And furthermore, many of them are employed insofar as they are employed by companies which are global or international companies, which are in England because England is part of the EU and its financial and banking and whatever system, labor system makes it desirable. So they're actually voted against their own interests. That's not unusual in the world, by the way, but they really voted against their interests. Who to blame for all this? Does it matter who to blame for us? Well, obviously, David Cameron, for starters, in the short term. That is to say, his calling a referendum was absolutely stupid, right? And at the time, people said it was stupid, but he was out for his own political career, his votes, and so forth and so on. So he created this huge mess. But if he hadn't called for it, somebody else might have called for it, right? So, whatever. Now you have an England which is in total disarray. Neither party has a leader. The Labour Party, like the Democratic Party, is losing participation, right? Because a large chunk of the Labour Party is, like Trump's folks, anti-international agreements, anti-free trade, anti-everything. Free trade, they think, produces, unemployment, and so forth and so on. So that the Labour Party, which would be in opposition, is in a total state of disarray. And there was, as you probably know, a vote of no confidence against Jeremy, who, absolutely blew it in terms of giving tepid support of staying in the EU. And otherwise being, a kind of supported by the hard left in the Labour Party, but not sort of more centrist Blairite Labourites. I'm just identifying it. You don't have to be in favor of Blair, but just there's a range of political views in the Labour Party. And the Conservative Party also, as you probably know, had a range of opinions. That is to say, Cameron and his lot were in favor of staying in and try to make an argument, but there are quite a few people in the Conservative Party who also want out. And they don't want out, by Conservative Party, I now mean the MPs, not just supporters. And those people wanted out not because they were sort of ignorant of the EU, but rather because they are, in a sense, nationalists and, and to some extent xenophobic, but they're nationalists, and they don't like the idea of, quote unquote, giving up any sovereignty to an international institution. And they've railed against that for a long time. So within both parties, you have a range, right? And within both parties, you now need new leadership. And within both parties, it's unclear who the new leaders might be. The one that is bandied about this morning anyway, and yesterday, is Theresa May. She's been the Home Secretary, and how can I describe her to you? She's sort of a Thatcherite figure in the sense that she comes from humble background, which many conservative MPs don't. She is incredibly hardworking, very responsible, gets things done, somewhat actually colorless in some ways, which she actually has addressed and said, I'm not good on the media and so forth. But she's a totally serious person. And what's right and wrong about her in this moment is that she actually she was against Brexit, but she was not out in front of that issue. So she's vaguely in favor of staying in the EU, right? And at the same time, however, she's anti-immigration. She thinks, as Home Secretary, immigration has mucked up the works in England. So that's a funny split, within her. Beneath her are lots of different people, and you can ask about them, and we can get into that. In the case of the Labour Party, it's even further disarray. And who might lead the Labour Party. All kinds of people have been put forward, but it's not clear what's what. The way you change a leader in the British system might just be worth mentioning, which is that the party, a parliament puts forth two names, and those names then are voted by all the members of that party. So they can then decide between the two names that Parliament has put forward. Right? And then, if you have a new leader, presumably that person will want to have an election. And then God knows what happens in the election. All right. So it's unclear. There is no question on the part of economists that Britain leaving the EU will hurt the British economy in different ways that we can talk about if you have questions about it. It is also the case that now everybody is backpedaling. And they're saying, well, we got to think about this. We're not going to invoke Article 50. Article 50 is to say we want to leave. No one, by the way, has ever done that, actually leave. However, people have had a plebiscite like Denmark that decided they should leave. Then they had regrets. They had a second plebiscite and decided not to leave. Right? So you could have another plebiscite, but referendum. But Cameron has already said, no, we're not going to do this. We'll see. The second thing that is being talked about in Great Britain is what else could you possibly do to get yourself, out of this mess. One of the things you could do is for Scotland to say, our parliament is going to vote, and they're going to vote against leaving the EU, in which case, under some interpretations of the law, that can't really happen then, because the parliaments, under the current law, the parliaments of Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland get a voice. Right? So that raises a problem. The more likely scenario would be for Britain to go ahead anyway and say, never mind Scotland, and override that, and override the House of Lords interpretation, and then Scotland will probably have a vote on leaving Great Britain, and then they would apply as an independent country to the EU. That would split up Great Britain. This is not a good thing, right? You have little countries. Now, Wales voted in favor of getting out of the EU, so they would presumably stay. But Northern Ireland actually voted to stay in the EU. Well, Northern Ireland doesn't have the option that Scotland does, but Northern Ireland could decide that what they want to do is join the other Ireland, right? The country of Ireland, which is a member of the EU. But don't forget here, and that's been written about in the US press, don't forget here, that's got a problem, because the country of Ireland is Catholic. And the Protestants in Northern Ireland, they've just calmed down in Northern Ireland, will fight, and you might reignite the civil war in Northern Ireland. So now, no matter how you look at this, the future of politics in England is at stake, the future of Great Britain is at stake, right? And now let's flip it around and look at the European side of it. England is now, or UK is now saying, let's go slowly, let's negotiate something. Let's actually stay in the common market part, but let's get out of free movement of people, okay? So if you get out of the free movement of people, then you would have a sort of halfway situation. The European Union says, you've got to be kidding. This is not a cafeteria. You're either a member of the EU or you're not a member of the EU, okay? For very good reason, because there are lots of other EU countries, including the politics, as earlier described, of France and some other countries, where the right wing is also pushing, yeah, these free trade agreements are fine, let's keep the economy going, but we want out of everything else. Okay, so the EU is disinclined to grant what the best scenario is for the UK, right? They're not going to probably, I'm at least asserting, they're not going to get the best scenario. They will get some arrangement, right? But they're not going to get the best scenario. The next best scenario that you've probably seen in the media, and that's why I'm raising, is we in Great Britain can do what Norway did. Norway opted into the free market, but Norway also agreed in terms of the free movement of people. But Norway didn't agree to anything else, right? Well, the trouble with that is that Norway is a little country that to some extent doesn't care about playing a major role in the world. For Great Britain to be part of the EU and lose its vote entirely, because Norway has no vote in the EU, is an unthinkable prospect, right? No British Prime Minister, Labour or Conservative, in my view, can agree to something where England is bound by some things and participates by some things, or the UK as a whole, but it doesn't get a vote, it doesn't get a seat at the table. For those of you who are media junkies like I am, you might have noticed that yesterday the EU had a meeting without the Prime Minister of England, right? They're saying, you want to get out, screw you. We're having our own meeting and we're, setting up. Well, that would be the permanent condition under a Norway plan. So that's not a viable plan. So how does this look from the perspective of the EU? While Great Britain is saying, let's go slowly, let's figure this out, let's get new leaders, maybe have a new election, talk about it, backpedal, all the lies that we're told, we're taking back. They weren't, all these things that we said, we misspoke. It wasn't true. We didn't put in that much money, we didn't do this, we didn't do that. It's all just, actually, let's talk about this very rationally and very slowly. Well, not surprisingly, the EU says, no way, we want to do this in a hurry. And the reason they want to do it in a hurry is because this is encouraging the right wing in all their countries who are also lobbying to get out. The worst thing for the other European countries, for Angela Merkel in Germany or for Hollande in France and so forth, is to let the Marie Pens and whatever get step in saying, yeah, well, they're thinking about it and everybody's negotiating. Let us tell you how bad this is and why we need to do the same thing as Great Britain. So from the European perspective, they want to move relatively rapidly. They want a clean, roadmap as to where they're going to go, and then take it from there rather than this dilly-dallying. Now, of course, people like Angela Merkel are very reasonable. They say, well, it doesn't have to be overnight. We give them some time and stuff. But for the UK to say, well, we don't even have to invoke Article 50 for another year or two, and then it's 4 years down the road, and so forth, the EU is not accepting it. Now, for a moment, let me turn to these EU institutions because they will have a bearing on the discussion. The argument is not simply that Brussels is telling us what to do, but that Brussels make rules that we have to abide by, and we don't have a say. Well, first of all, you already know that that can't be the case because there's been the European Council, there's a British representative, and so forth. And also the UK is represented in the European Parliament, so they get a say, and so forth. So to begin with, that can't be the case. But it is the case that in the post-World War II world, what sovereignty means has been reconfigured for this country and for every other country in the world. Because given the fact that you don't have 25 countries or 52 countries in the world, among other things, you need some rules, and you need some binding rules so that you don't have chaos out there. So there is a whole bunch of international law and international treaties and international institutions that bind you to behave in certain ways or find fault if you don't behave in certain ways. Let's take the European Human Rights Court, which is one of the things that drives the right crazy in Europe. If you have a claim that your human rights have been violated, right? And the claim can be something like years ago, one of the arguments was that it was a violation of human rights for the British Army not to take in women, right? So what happens? Well, what happens is that some women went to the British courts and said, we think it's a violation of human rights for women to be excluded from the military. And the British courts ruled that it was okay to exclude women from the military because, they're weaker, less able, they would undermine the morale of the army, all the arguments that we've had domestically about that issue. So the women took it to the European Human Rights Court, right? And the European Human Rights Court ruled that it was a violation of human rights. And the British immediately started admitting women. Now, I give you this stark example because we discuss women and women's rights in this country, but there are very many areas where people feel that their rights have been violated, and whether it's human rights or administrative rights or whatever, the first resort is to your national courts. Mostly things are resolved in national courts, but if they're not resolved in national courts, there are then multinational courts in Europe that you can take it to. And in the case of the global sphere, there's the International Court of Justice and there's the International Criminal Court, right? And when those courts rule, in theory, the state is supposed to adhere to it. So, for example, years ago, you were all old enough to remember the mess in Nicaragua and so forth. I won't bore you with the details of that, but in any event, the U.S. blew up mines in the water outside of Nicaragua and stuff. Anyway, to make a long story short, that was taken to International Court of Justice, and the International Court of Justice ruled against the United States. This was during the Reagan administration. And so the U.S. should have paid compensation to the government. Reagan just said, never mind, we're not doing this, right? So if you're the United States, you can just ignore these things if you want. You do it at a cost because you lose respect and influence and so forth. But if you're a small country, very often it pays to do what these courts have to say. So these kinds of things drive people mad. They drive Americans mad. Sovereignty means you don't have to, you're in control of your own borders. Immigrants can come in. Courts can't rule against you. Who the hell are these other people to tell you what to do, right? So in a post-World War II world where the elite, liberals, internationalists, which by the way included Republicans in the U.S., said, let's have an international, transnational system. It's to the benefits of us all. And let's set up rules and institutions and so forth. From the U.S. perspective, it was going to benefit a big country. And from the small country's perspective, it was going to help them play a role in the world and participate in world affairs. So everybody kind of bought into it. And in 2016, a large chunk of the world is no longer buying into it because things aren't going right in your country, and you blame it on outsiders. Things aren't going right in your country, you blame it on immigrants, and what you really want is control of your borders. Now, control of the borders in the age of missiles and other flying objects and people moving around and global environmental issues being the big issue, this is a pipe dream. The response is, what institutions, the role they play, the leadership they have, and what rules they impose, and if they're fair, and so forth. But you can't have, global attention to the climate. It's a global problem. It's not a local problem. Yes, there are local things you have to do, but if your neighbor doesn't do it, then it's worthless for you to do it. So the issues have changed. But people in countries which are angry, or people with subgroups in countries which are angry and alienated and have nostalgia for the past, don't want to face the present and the future. And the question then becomes, how can you turn that mentality around? And the mentality obviously needs to be turned around in sort of two major ways. One, you need to attend to the conditions of those people which make them feel like losers, right? Number one. And number two, you need leadership which explains things to people. One of the things that Cameron can be faulted on, and I even would say I'm a fan of Obama, I will not hide it, but Obama can be blamed, is that they don't really sort of have the skill of Roosevelt and fireside chats where they explain things to people. That is to say, they assume that the elite knows what they're talking about, right? And on the other hand, those people who don't want to pay attention to the elite are clueless as to what the variables are. And there really hasn't been a real serious effort in most countries to explain things to people. Angela Merkel sometimes tries. Hollande doesn't even bother. And when he does, nobody pays attention. Italy has too many governments. The small Scandinavian countries don't carry the weight. And so forth and so on. So that the idea that you can just sort of say, these people are stupid, and they don't know their interest, is no fix, it is no solution. And unless countries and the international system attends to explaining things better and getting around to the idea that there is a reason why people feel so alienated. They may be wrong. I think they're wrong, as a matter of fact. But it needs to be explained better. And in England, before the Brexit vote and so forth, there were sort of arguments, this is best for the economy. Well, if you're Mr. Smith sitting in a North English town and you've been unemployed for 5 years and your kids can't get proper education and you see no future, it doesn't make any sense to be told this is good for everybody, because you think that the everybody means the elite, the 1%, the people who are talking at you, but it doesn't seem to percolate down to you. So I guess what I'm saying is there are monumental structural and political problems which are worldwide, which are not receiving attention or proper attention. And so you have an erosion of the post-World War II structure and understanding of things. And it's so difficult and so messy and so complicated and so multi-layered that no one has a fix. They're just layers and layers of things that need to be attending to. And that is not a very satisfactory answer. It's not a satisfactory answer to give to voters in this country or other countries. It's not a satisfactory answer for the people on the ground who think that they're suffering, right? And it's also not very satisfactory that populist and xenophobic leaders on the whole, have been better explaining the xenophobia and the reason for populism than everybody else has. Because the rest of us here sit around and saying, what is wrong with these people? Why don't they see the world the way we see it? But they don't. They don't in Michigan, and they don't in Ohio, and they don't in England, and so forth and so on. So, have I depressed you enough? Would you like more depressing? Now, one quick thing before the break, and I mainly want to take your questions and see the questions you have rather than my talking at you. But what about the rest of the world? The rest of the world, of course, is looking on to it. Putin, as the media probably has told you, has said almost nothing. Why has Putin said almost nothing? Because it's in his interest not to say anything. Let the West disintegrate on its own. Hey, this is great. The European Union disintegrates, European institutions will disintegrate, they're all in disarray. Great for us. Okay, so he's being very quiet. And as somebody, maybe on Charlie Rose or somebody said, when Putin is quiet, watch out. Right? This is not a good thing. The Chinese are busy mostly with their own affairs and are kind of have a wait-and-see attitude. But many countries that trade a lot, that move workers around, move technocrats around, are of course very worried, right? Because the industrial world is a place for their underemployed, skilled labor to go. And by the way, that is of course another variable. It's not just that poor, unemployed, uneducated people leave. Large chunks of the refugees, at least, are in fact highly educated, highly skilled. You might have noticed in between the lines when Syrian refugees get interviewed. Have you noticed how many of them speak English? Yes, there are a lot of them. They're professional people, they're educated, they've learned English. Lots of people around the world decide their future lies in learning how to speak English. So they've learned English, they cope, they have skills and so forth. Most societies actually need them. And so this is another sort of slightly major point. And that is that the hostility and the xenophobia in Europe in particular against immigration is very misplaced, because those societies actually need immigrants. And they need immigrants for demographic reasons. They have aging populations, and within the next 10 years, they badly will need people from other parts of the world to do the labor. Okay, and it's somewhat less true in this country because our demographics are better. Our population is not as old as the European and the Japanese and so forth. So the US is in a slightly better situation in terms of its demographics. But these European countries actually will need workers from other countries. Now, if you are a lefty in this country or somewhere else, you will say, but these people all take unskilled jobs when they come, and these unskilled jobs depress the pay. And as a consequence, Americans, good, blue-blooded Americans with a gun or two at home, can't get jobs because, all of these semi-legals and illegals, they're working in, McDonald's or whatever, and clean your motel rooms and so forth, and take away jobs. Now, think about this for a minute. Supposing the lettuce pickers in the San Joaquin Valley would all be shipped home, as Trump would like us to do, or similarly in various European countries. You close your borders, you send them all back to wherever they came from. What would the situation be like? Would the unemployed factory worker from Michigan come to California to pick lettuce? Would the unemployed, undereducated black youth from Chicago come to pick lettuce? Of course not. This is a ridiculous idea, right? Also, the poor in most countries, including the US countries, supposing you set up barriers to the importation of all these cheap goods which make Americans unemployed. Well, guess what? The prices at Walmart will rise astronomically. And who buys the stuff in Walmart? They don't buy it in boutique stores. People go to Walmart who have little money, right? So it would change the nature of the economy in this country and in Europe, right? The cheap goods, cheap products would stop coming in, but then everything would get more expensive. Well, the idea then is, if everything is more expensive, people's wages would go up. Not necessarily. So that's a harebrained idea. It doesn't exactly work that way. And finally, I want to say that this business with Brexit, the discussion of the populists in the countries about leaving international institutions, the consequences that have been discussed in the last week are almost all economic consequences. And you may accuse me of, being a political scientist and therefore saying this, but actually the political fallout out of this is even more serious than the economic fallout. Because you can make modest economic adjustments as you go along. And economic changes take a fairly long time between trading and so forth. But the reason or the benefit to the industrial countries, including US, to have a TPP, to have a NAFTA, to have all of these things, is the fact that it's actually politically sensible to do. It is much more sensible to have a stable, politically stable, relatively democratic, relatively affluent Mexico next door, to have a country that is in chaos, where gazillions of people will want to come, that's unstable in every imaginable way. And that's true for all the industrial countries. It is the political fallout from this, whether it's right-wing populism, xenophobia, the right-wing winning, and so forth and so on, in both the short term and in the long term, is far more serious, in my view, than even the economic fallout. And that is one of the things that the Brexit people didn't calculate. What they calculated is satisfying the xenophobia and the populism and all the rest. They didn't really see what the political fallout was going to be. The closest person who kind of recognized the fallout of the leaders was actually Angela Merkel, who said to her parliament and made speeches and said, the politics of this is what really concerns me. And it's actually what really concerns concerns me about this in the long term, because we could very easily move into government after government going right-wing, a kind of neo-fascism arising and so forth. And that is an utter nightmare, and that's what keeps me up at night. To what extent the Europeans managed to negotiate some trade treaties and so forth. And it's not, I gave you the Mexican example, but I can give you examples of Southeast Asia and so forth. What everyone wants to say is wrong with the TPP, which is the trade agreement, right, that Obama is trying to negotiate and everybody is against, Trump is against, Hillary is against, and so forth. The economic benefits to the U.S. might be minor, and we will have some economic dislocation, which the government should, going back to the early part of the talk, should actually be attending to make it minor. But politically tying countries together through trade, through climate change, and so forth, is what stabilizes a globalized world, right? It's the politics and not just the economics. So that, I think, hasn't received enough attention. So you've listened to me long enough. Take a break, and then we'll talk, okay? I want to say two things that came up in the break. One is that, of course, I didn't address the fact that the EU itself and its institutions badly need revision and need improvement and need change. So that some of the perfectly well-informed, intelligent people say that the EU, to some extent, is to blame for its own, people being opposed to it. I think that's not entirely true, but the EU is it's worth a lecture on itself to talk about what's wrong with the EU right now. So there's huge EU problems. And going ahead, if the EU does not reform itself, it's a dead duck as well, institutionally. And I would say something fairly similar about the UN. The UN badly needs to be changed to be made relevant again. And so that's, a topic for another talk, but I want to just say that that's part of it. Even the greatest fans of the EU acknowledge that there are huge problems. The other issue that I didn't really address has to do with, I talked mostly about, or at least it sounded like I talked mostly about the sort of northern tier European countries. And for a long time, the southern tier countries have said that they were disadvantaged, and there's a good case to be made that they have been disadvantaged. And that's the EU's fault, and not just the fault of other countries. So that, too, is a topic unto itself. The thing to be said, however, in both cases is that the people who have profited from the existence of free movement in the EU and so forth, those people have profited coming from all countries, north, south, and so forth. So, for example, right now you have 500,000 French people living in England, in London, in the area. You have that many Spaniards living there. You have, hundreds and thousands of Poles and so forth. So those are the people who are ambitious enough to say to themselves, we're going to take advantage of that. And the people who are so anti all of that, free movement and so forth, are obviously not those people. But I don't want to have it misunderstood. There are just lots of people in Europe who would say, we've really profited from it. And the lots of people include the explanation for the vote in England, which I also didn't mention, which was that the majority of the people who voted to stay were younger than the people who were to move. And the reason, of course, is that the younger people have benefited from the free movement, not just for work, but also for education. Tons of people in England go to schools either paid for by the EU, which are in the UK, or go and get master's degrees in other countries, because many of the European countries now have higher education system that take place in English. So you can go to Holland and get a master's degree in English, in the English language. I don't mean in English, in the English language. So they've profited from that. But even the offspring of kind of working class folks, the fact that in high school or even in middle school, they took trips to Paris, to Rome, to different places. The younger generation has a very different experience of Europe than the older generation, and I failed to mention that. So John has been asking to ask a question, and he wants to use the microphone, right?
Just for a minute.
He's going to give me a hard time.
I am. Yesterday, Ronnie talked to me and said, don't bother to come because I know you're depressed and I'll depress you even more. I was astonished at how optimistic your comments were. I thought you were going to get into what I regard for England and the United States. I won't go, and I promise you I'll only be a minute. For England and the United States, I think there is a deeper problem you know about, but you didn't discuss. And that is the spread of democracy. The voice of the people has been heard, and that's the trouble. Heretofore, for about 70 years, the mass of people have been contained within formal political parties that have modified the views of people by and large. Those parties have had dreadful moments, but by and large, they've restrained the populace. And especially with your century of technology that allows people independently to learn to express their views. Wall Street poll showed that the average American reads 18 minutes a day, watches TV 3 hours, and sits at the computer. Anyway, the real problem is the spread of democracy in the future that will express itself in these xenophobic and anti-intellectual ways. Thank you.
Okay. So that's a great statement, but I'm willing to partially argue with it, and that is that it was a reason why our founding fathers didn't believe in direct democracies and had representatives, right? And we in the state of California are all too familiar with this problem because instead of letting our elected representatives in Sacramento make decisions, we put things on the ballot that some cuckoo outfit wants and then puts lots of money in, and all of a sudden we're stuck with it, right? So the notion, the problem, and indirectly, of course, I mentioned it, was Cameron deciding to put this up for a vote rather than having Parliament decide it for a vote. Now, there are people on the left, populists, I suppose even on the right, who are saying, yes, but, through these filters of legislators and so forth, and we know how horrible our Congress is and so forth, we want, to directly speak up. But that's, of course, very dangerous. It's very dangerous to have a dysfunctional parliament or a dysfunctional Congress, but it's also even more dangerous to just have, people in plebiscites. We are, and I target this particularly to John, we are not, small Greek villages where we are standing around having discussions.
By the way, why are you so opposed to small units, small countries? What's wrong with small countries? Some bigger countries should be smaller.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll mention one. You're familiar with it. The U.S. of A. What a mistake it is.
Yeah, well, here we are. So at the end of the Second World War, the membership of the UN was, I can't remember, 52 or 54 countries.
Yes.
We now have close to 100. Much of the colonial system's creation of states might break up. A world of 300 or 400 countries is an even bigger mess than having more larger units that are governed. The problem is that the institutions of most countries are not working for historical reasons, colonial reasons, corruption reasons, all kinds of reasons, different subject. But if they were working, having indirect democracy is a better system than having direct democracy for the very reason that we're discussing. So, thank you, John.
Would work into your diet addiction.
Can you repeat the
custom of the business of war?
Yes, well, if the U.S. had not spent, I don't know, how many $1 trillion in Iraq, we might have been able to do something about our infrastructure and the re-education of unemployed workers and so forth and so on. The huge war machinery is, of course, what takes or seeps resources out of the system to do some of these things. And when governments say, we don't want to get further in debt, we don't have the resources for military stuff always seem to be there. Now, that's on the one hand, and I completely agree with the gist of your argument. On the other hand, of course, having, let's say, a NATO and putting the resources jointly together is a lot better than each country building up its own military to fight its neighbor, right? So while NATO is not on the table in terms of the future of the EU, NATO is on the table, as are all the European institutions, because many of the populists, many of the right wing also want to get rid of NATO, right? And people on the left, aren't sure what they want to do. So, yes, the war and war machinery and so forth. Still, even with these huge expenditures, which I'm not in favor of, by the way, but even with these huge expenditures, the lack of priority to fix domestic problems is an issue, because it would be perfectly possible for the U.S. and for the U.K. and so forth to prioritize infrastructure, health care, education, and so forth. We're just not doing that. And part of the things, of course, the population, our fellow citizens here or in Europe also aren't keen in doing that, right? And the people that are in leadership positions send their kids to private schools, right? So they don't recognize the deterioration of the school system. Was it yesterday the New York Times had that big spread about education in Detroit? They morphed everything to charter schools, and now the charter schools aren't educating anybody either, and so forth. So we have huge problems, and they're real problems, and they're real problems in France and Germany and England and the United States. They're not being addressed. But the forces that oppose trying to address them are, generally speaking, the people who argue less government, right? And let's not, tax people, and let's not spend any money on these things. Yes?
Then why is it those are the same people that say we have to spend more on war?
Yes.
And why are we letting the terrorists win by causing us to invest in TSA and all these useless things that are to prevent terrorism and drone bombings and war things that distract us from domestic?
Yeah. Well, it's a huge question, and it's actually a kind of I don't want to avoid it, but it's a kind of topic unto itself. I mean, what has created this terrorism? Lots of things have created it, not least the end of the Iraqi war and the disposition of it. And by the way, I am not of the school, though some of you might be, who says, well, the terrorism in Iraq is the failure of the Iraqi government. It is the failure of the Iraqi government, but it is the failure of the U.S. at the end of the Iraqi war, which cut out all the Sunni leadership, all the military, put them in jail, and so forth. People, just as people become populist and xenophobic, people become terrorists because they see hopeless situation. right? And yes, it's true that religion nowadays plays a very major part in the Muslim world and so forth. But, you know, we've had other times in history, think the Crusades and whatnot, where religion becomes the ideology, right, that motivates you. And in the absence of, or in the presence of the non-functioning of other things, and in the absence of counter ideologies, for example, democratic, liberal, whatever, you can understand why a person in Iraq or in some other country might decide at the age of 24, for that matter, a person in the United States might decide that, you know, being a terrorist and giving your life for the cause is a meaningful activity. But there again, it's not just the politics on the ground, which is true, and the military and all the rest of it. It's also, of course, as everybody has said, so I'm just repeating it, it's the internet and the business about being motivated, you know, on the internet to do things that you might have, you know, imagined in the schoolyard to hit, you know, to hit somebody, but you didn't imagine that you could join a group. Now, having said this, it's an overstatement because there have been terrorists since time immemorial. They just couldn't move around as quickly, and sometimes they were mafia, sometimes they were other things throughout history. So it's not unknown to have people to traipse around and kill and shoot and so forth. But the magnitude and the globalization of this is a major factor. And I don't think this is going to go away very quickly, no matter what happens in Britain or in the United States. It can be made worse. But I don't think this is a situation where anybody can have a single policy which stops this. This is going to go on for a decade or more. Another depressing conclusion. Yes, back there. Part of it.
Is it possible to imagine some form of unity or federation among the EU countries, or whatever we might call the new form, that left a certain amount of sovereignty in terms of, say, the monetary system? Because I just came back from 2 months in Italy, and Italy is in a terrible recession, which 20 years ago it would have been happy to deal with by devaluing the lira.
Right.
It has no lira anymore. And also, as somebody who witnessed the transformation from national currency to the EU, it was utterly unsystematic. I mean, Italy decided to do it by putting a zero at the end of everything. I mean, not asking what the euro and the lira meant, but saying, yes, if a caprese salad was 10,000 lira, which is like $5, let's make it 10 euro, which is like $15.
Right.
So I'm just saying, I didn't think the monetary changeover was successful, but why shouldn't these countries like Greece have the option of devaluating their own currency to have a little autonomy and hold up?
So that's a great question. The euro, the common currency, which, by the way, UK was not part of, right? You know that. And from the perspective of the UK, that was probably pretty smart. The euro is only workable if you have much closer political union. And since we're not about to get that, for all the reasons we've discussed, it is probably will be smart to get rid of the euro. Not just for one country opting, but just simply saying this was a failed project. It's nice for those of us who are tourists, we don't constantly have to change money, but for the economies, this is not working, and the reason it's not working is because it needed to be the first step to closer political union. That is not about to be in the cards in the next few years. Let's get rid of this. Maybe 20 years from now or 15 years from now, start again. But it is absolutely true that countries who are locked into the euro cannot manage their economies on a country-by-country basis in the interest of their citizens, which is, of course, one of the many hostilities, right? And if you're an older person in any of those countries, you say to yourself, the EU is causing this, the euro is causing this, and if you're a younger person traipsing around Europe, unemployed or employed, you're saying, this is great, I don't have to change currencies, so they feel it less. Go ahead.
Well, just a tiny addendum. I think people say Brussels for the EU, but many Europeans I know think, hey, Deutsche Bank. They think they're being run by Germany, and that's scary.
Yes, so that's a good point, and B leads me to make another point, which was that the motivating idea for the EU were really two in kind. One was to insure yourself somewhat against the Soviet Union, and number two, to prevent Germany from rising again and link everybody into a single system. Those were the two main reasons, and those were, by the way, the reasons the US strongly supported the EU, or the creation of the EU, even though it was not in our immediate economic interest. Okay, it's a really important consideration here. And the irony of this all is that with all these years, since the 58 or whatever, all these years of the EU, you now have a situation where the Soviet Union no longer exists, but Russia is out there fanning the flames, number one. And number two, Germany is the strongest country again, right? Now, the one thing about Germany right now is, and Angela Merkel and all the rest of it, is the fact that they're aware of it, which is why they so much fear England leaving, because they really, really don't want to be the dominant country. I'm not saying they're not Germans who would like to be the dominant country, but the government, the current government, understands the problem of the re-rise of Germany, all right, in many ways. And so the buffer against that is not France, but is England, UK. Right? And the argument of why they will want to make compromises with the UK is to keep UK in politically somehow, because it's a countervailing force to the UK. Now, you've heard Obama and others saying that UK is also important, UK is also important to keep the U.S. influence in Europe alive, because the U.S. has worked through the U.K. in the various halls of European negotiations, because the sort of representative liberal democracy, free trade, and all the rest of us is our sort of representatives in these discussions have been the UK, because of course the US has no seat at the table in the EU, right? So from an American perspective and a German perspective, this is a worst case scenario for slightly different reasons. But the German problem is huge. It is absolutely huge in everybody's mind. And all of us, more or less, not everybody, is old enough to recall the German problem. Yes?
This raises in my mind a question based slightly on personal experience. The question is, what's the concept of Europe? The personal experience is that shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, I had the opportunity, as luck would have it, to work progressively across the countries of Central Asia. And as I moved east, I found each one of them wanted to draw the curtain of Europe slightly to their east, because they didn't want Moscow controlling them yet again. I mentioned this to a Swiss junior diplomat once, and he just kind of recoiled in horror that Central Asians would consider themselves Europeans.
Yes, well, as you know, it's not just Central Asians. It's, you can go to...
Repeat that question, because I think there was some noise out here.
So I think if I got it correctly, it's that who is a European is a key issue, and who thinks of themselves as European. And lots of people way to the east of Europe that you would think considered themselves European, in a way saying we're also European. But don't forget that in history, in history, much of what became the Soviet Union, Russia, and you would the 19th century literature indicates how literary folks in Russia link themselves with France France and the elite considers themselves European and so forth. It's a very good question, and it's a very varied question, but now it's gotten very messy because while the so-called East European countries, which were under the umbrella of the Soviet Union, quickly tried to get themselves as part of the EU and to be part of Europe rather than the Soviet Union that they had just left. It is also the case that as they've joined one by one, some of them now have right-wing governments which are making the same case. That is, say, Hungary has a very nasty right-wing government. The Poles have just elected a very right-wing, nasty government. And even though the president of the EU Council, Mr. Tusk, is Polish, the government from his country is now anti-EU as well and is hoping that the UK will leave, and therefore they too can make individual arrangements that are different. Now, you might say, okay, so the Hungarians are a pain in the derriere, they're not in favor of freedom of the press anymore, they're anti-immigrants, they're nasty, Hungarians get out of the EU, this was probably a good thing. But it's not considered a good thing for most of the sort of intelligent European policymakers, because once you get out of the EU, the Russians will be very busy trying to annex them again. And that's exactly what Putin sees. Putin sees that you now have a different ball game, and maybe you can rebuild what was your former Soviet Union by building it out back into Europe. So the East Europeans, not to mention the Central Asians and so forth, it's serious business. Also to add to that, of course, that as you noticed from the airport attack in Turkey, folks from the former Soviet Union are also getting radicalized and joining ISIS. So it's not just people from the Middle East or an odd American here or there. This ISIS business is attractive as a counter ideology for lots of people moving east, whether it's Chechens or Bulgarians or Romanians or anybody else under the sun. And it's obvious, I'm sure, to most of you, but let me just say that a lot of these ISIS terrorists aren't either believers or at least practicing Muslims at all. I mean, Trump has that wrong. A lot of them aren't religious at all. I mean, they may be Muslims by name, right? But they're not particularly religious. They're motivated by the ideology to do something against the West. Right, and to harm the West and the allies of the West. And those are the chickens coming home to roost from post-colonialism, failed policies, the Iraqi war, and all of the rest. Israel, features very largely in people's in those terrorists' mind, right? And the U.S. support of Israel, and going back to David's question about the military, right? The largest amount of military aid the U.S. gives to Israel. If American public actually understood how much of the resources that could go into Detroit goes into Israel, they might also raise a few questions. So it's interlinked, and the bottom line here is we're in a very interdependent world, and these things move around and percolate and overlap, which is why to unravel them is almost impossible, whether it's in this room or anywhere else, which is it's going to take a lot of small steps in various places at various levels, national, subnational, international, to set this ship right. And that's a project for a decade or two. And not if you're going to get the kind of leadership from the right wing that we could get in this country, France could get, and so forth and so on. Yes.
The countries in the Middle East that are politically friendly with the UK and the US, how are they viewing Brexit? Do they have any concerns?
It depends on, the industrial parts of those countries, the oil companies and investment and all the rest of it, would just as soon the EU continues to be operational because it gives them a larger playing field and so forth. How the citizens feel, I have no idea. I have seen no polls. You've lived in one of them, you might have a better idea. But I think it's unclear. And of course, part of the U.S. alliance with those countries and with Saudi Arabia and so forth is an alliance of convenience, right? On the one hand, they support things we are against, and on the other hand, it used to be for oil reasons, and now it's for military reasons and alliance reasons. We play, ball with them. Now, playing ball with undesirable countries is not a new phenomenon, but it's part of of that part of the world. It's unclear, I think. Mark.
So you painted a very bleak picture of what the world is like.
Yes.
And I wonder if there isn't a counter narrative that may be underlying some of this. Because you've also told us about how through globalization and the modern technologies, we are all interconnected and we need each other and need these structures in order to do anything. Mm-hmm. Politically, we may want to kick them all out and punish them, but immediately, as soon as those agreements are breached, it seems to me there's going to be a realization that we're hurting ourselves. So we need them. So is there a, maybe I'm thinking that what we is muddling through, because we have this elaborate set of structures that enable the globalized world to function, that is going to continue. There's going to be a globalized world irrespective of whether countries split apart or do.
Yeah, it's a good point, but here's the problem. Muddling through at some levels, if you wind up with a Trump, if you wind up with a Marie Le Pen, will do so much harm that the muddling part that continues is submerged in these, horrible other things that happen. But part of the muddling through means you have funny bedfellows now. So, for example, the Chamber of Commerce, right, yesterday or the day before, all of a sudden speaks up and says, we can't support Trump's anti-free trade policy. Now, the Chamber of Commerce is not usually a liberal, institution, right? So you have kind of funny groups coming into play who are all of a sudden saying, this is wrong. The Pope is usually not a factor in enlightened policy, but all of a sudden, there's a Pope who actually at some levels has enlightened policies. So you have, if you go back 20 years and see who's on what side, and all of a sudden look at 2016, you see a funny scrambling, right? And in that scramble might be an opportunity for creativity, right? But it means creative leaders, because at the end of the day, people in this room, we're not running the world, and at best, we might have a modest influence locally, but even that's a little iffy. Did I answer your question, Boris? There's no answer, but you're identifying something that's correct, but it's just not necessarily going to stop the worst case scenarios.
But see, what I'm thinking, Ronnie, is that the same politics that are just disrupting the traditional ways of governing and thinking about these relationships in the world, that same politics can, if they are finding themselves, surprise, this isn't working and I'm losing my job because of this, because we can't agree on whether we should do it in ounces or liters or something like that, will that be a countervailing thing down the road?
Yeah, well, that's the Bernie Sanders line, right? And I don't mean to start a conflict here, because many of you, I suppose, are Bernie Sanders fans. I mean, that in a way is a counter, right? The trouble with the Bernie Sanders, that is to say populism from the left, the trouble with all of that is that you would need leaders who actually make sense. And he makes sense in terms of identifying the problem, but has absolutely no solutions and makes no sense in terms of the solution. The response to problems with trade that is accurate, namely workers sometimes lose their jobs, is not to stop having trade pacts, but rather do something about the workers who lose their jobs. The response to, I don't know, the environment is not to say, well, we need to do something, but to figure out that sometimes you have to give up something to have an international treaty. The response to lots of things, we should have free education. Yeah, great. Free state education, states are the ones that are funding state universities by and large. How are you going to get quote-unquote semi-sovereign states? How are you going to get the state of Texas to all of a sudden, because Bernie Sanders becomes president, to offer free education? I mean, all of these things are wonderful goals, but in order to achieve them, you have to have specific, I mean, I don't mean to sound like Hillary, I'm not, particularly a fan of hers either, but you need to have strategies and ways of getting there, and he doesn't have strategies and ways of getting there. So, if what you say is going to work, what you need is a level of sophistication and experience and so forth on that side, which proposes strategies that are actually workable. And there are those walking around. I mean, it's not that the human species is inaccurate. It's just that somebody has to glob on to one or two of these strategies and show how they can be made to work. There was first a hand here, and then I'll catch you.
What do you think the chances are that there might be a revote?
I can't tell. I mean, what are the chances of a re-vote on Brexit? I mean, there are now 4 million signatures or something, but 17 million people voted against it. And as long as Cameron says we will not have a re-vote, there won't be a re-vote. Now, whoever the next leader is could say, I don't agree with Cameron, we're going to have a re-vote. But it's unlikely. I mean, it's just a hunch that it's unlikely, but could happen.
Because when you look at the actual numbers, from what I saw, 72% of the people voted, but it's 52-48, so if you do the math, there's only 36% of the people in all of England voted for Brexit. So if someone makes that case, they're saying, wait a minute.
Yes, sure. But it would in fact take the prime minister, whoever, and to get support of his party and maybe the other party to say this was so much of a mess, we're going to do the same thing Denmark did and have a revote. It's possible, but how likely, I wouldn't bet on it,
What you just said about Bernie Sanders on the left is absolutely true about Donald Trump on the right.
Sure.
That he has all of these things he's going to change, and he has no clue about how to implement
Exactly.
one of them.
No, but I responded because Mark's question is, couldn't somebody do something on the other side? And I'm saying you can't be the flip side of Trump by having great ideas of what's wrong. We all know what's wrong. You have to have precise ideas and policies to fix it. Huh?
Program is boring.
Right. Anyway, yes, back there.
Now that Brexit has been voted on, do you think there will be, and summer is starting with all these refugees, do you think the UK will be able to stop some of the volume this summer? Or will they put into place pretty quickly some anti-refugee, numbers?
Let me bore you for a minute with a technical issue. UK, until it leaves the EU, cannot stop people who are inside the EU from moving in. So the Polish plumber can continue to move in. Once they leave the EU, and once they have no obligation for free movement, they can tell the Poles to go back home, right? By the way, if you needed a plumber and the Poles all went back home, you couldn't find one, but that's neither here nor there. But that aside, so that's the first thing, the movement around the EU, right? The second thing is, what about people from outside the EU? And there are two categories. They're all under the rubric migrants, right? They've migrated from one place to another. Now, if they're refugees, the word refugee has a particular legal definition. And in order to be a refugee, when you seek asylum and you get granted asylum, at that particular point, the only country that has an obligation to keep you and not send you back is the country which granted you asylum. Right? So currently, you could be granted asylum in country X, and once you're granted asylum, you can move to another country in the EU, right? Because of the free movement EU. If they were not part of the EU, that country has to keep you under asylum regulations, but no one else has to take you. Okay, so the UK would be in a position to say we don't grant anybody asylum, which is a different, issue. Now, the larger category of immigrants would be governed by the laws of England or UK, but that's also the case now. That is to say, if you or I wanted to permanently move to the UK and wanted to work there, we would have to apply for a work permit, and if we wanted to become English, we would have to apply for English citizenship, which is not easy to get. Okay, so I don't mean to make things needlessly complicated for you, but it's actually, the media throws around words refugees, immigrants, migrants, whatever, and they're different categories, and each one would have different implications as to whether UK left the EU or didn't leave the EU. Okay, in the case of the US, it has a very complicated procedure for giving people asylum. And generally speaking, if you are a refugee somewhere, the U.S. has the UN Refugee Organization vet you before the U.S. State Department will consider you, which is why it takes 2 years and 3 years. So the Syrians who've come in to the U.S. haven't knocked on the U.S. door. They're coming from refugee camps, like in Lebanon, have been vetted, and then get vetted again by the State Department. So each country, whether it's EU or non-EU, has a kind of a way to deal with the issue. And if Canada gives somebody asylum, okay, for example, just to play it out one more time, that person doesn't have an automatic right to come to the U.S. at all. Canada has an obligation to not force that person to go back in a situation which the UN Refugee Treaty and international law says will risk their lives. Okay, your life has to be at risk. And one of the complexity of the International Refugee Treaty and the whole international law is that only being at risk for your life due to your politics, religion, etc. is considered a criteria for being a refugee. Economic difficulty does not entitle you to asylum and refugee status, and that has been debated in international law for years, because many people feel that being, starving somewhere is as bad as having your life risked because of your politics. And at the same time, people say, well, if your life is at risk because of politics, you might be shot, and if you can't make a living for yourself and your family, you can be helped with aid and so forth. It's an incredibly complicated and interesting conversation, but it would play itself out in the various ways that I suggested. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I don't even know how to ask this, but let's assume that those people the French and the Spaniards, for example, who went over to England and now have made homes there and jobs and blah, 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 and they have children. What's going to happen when the EU says, okay, see you later, bye, to those folks? Do the kids, are they English now, or are they, what is it going to be like here, where you have kids from Mexican parents?
Which, by the way, the idea, if you're born in the United States, you're an American citizen, right? That's actually unusual in the world. In most countries, you're considered to be whatever your parents are. right? So if, for example, you're born in the United States, you're automatically a citizen, but if your parents are Spanish, Spain still considers you a citizen. So if you want to leave the U.S. and go live in Spain and consider yourself Spanish, you can, even though you never lived there before, right? So there are kind of two ways of becoming citizens, either by birth or by ancestry, which is one of the reasons after the breakup of the Soviet Union, these Germans from Siberia, whose families lived in Siberia for generations, all of a sudden had a total right to move to Germany and become and be German citizens, while the Turks, who've been living there for 2 generations, still didn't have entitlement to become citizens, and their children didn't have entitlement. That's somewhat changed now in Germany, but still, right? So it's pretty complicated. So unless you're in a country where birth is what gives you citizenship, which is not England, then you know. Now, what about all these, there's an auxiliary question to that, and what about all these Spaniards, let's say, father might work in a tech company and this and that, and he just freely moved to the UK, maybe intending to go back to Spain, maybe not, kids are born and so forth and so on. Will all these people be automatically kicked out of the UK? It raises an interesting question. No, not automatically, because they can be given work permits, which allows them to work and to stay, right? Not citizenship necessarily, but just work permits. And the UK businesses and so forth would be crazy to get rid of their workforce overnight, because it would completely disrupt the economy of the UK, right? So that won't necessarily happen. If, on the other hand, you were a Spaniard and you became a UK citizen, then of course your kids are born in the UK and they're citizens, right, of the UK, and but they're also citizens if they want to be in Spain, right? So it goes back to that question.
So I guess the auxiliary is the people who are in, the Spaniards and French who are in UK now are on work permits, but all of them will have to be renegotiated.
No, many of them are not on work permits. If you're an American, you're on work permits. If you're part of the EU, you're not on work permits, you just moved.
So they'll just have to all get work permits.
Yeah, right, of some kind, and that hasn't even been sorted out. Yes, sir?
If you come from mixed heritage, you know, you're half Swiss and say you're half from Sierra Leone, who are you a citizen? You say,
it depends on that country, and if Sierra Leone says, if either of your parents are Sierra Leonean, you're also Sierra Leone. If Sierra Leone says you're only Sierra Leone if your father is a Sierra Leone or your mother's Sierra, then you have to go back to the individual country, and each country has different rules. All right. Then for the U.S., of course, there's the whole ethnic thing. That is to say, we refer to people as, not always pejoratively, as Chinese. And by that we mean ethnically Chinese. We don't necessarily mean Chinese citizens. And those people might have been here for generations, right? So how people loosely talk about people is not necessarily their legal status. Okay, and some countries don't automatically make you have you be a citizen if you're born outside the country. On the other hand, each country has yet different policies. You're all going to go to sleep about when you have to register at age 18 in order to claim that citizenship and so forth. It's incredibly complicated, which is why people who are between parents and societies, generally speaking, get lawyers at some point to help them sort things out so they don't make a mistake and they wind up being the citizen of the country they want to be a citizen.
You mentioned large amount of aid, particularly Israel, and you mentioned it once before. Can you give us an idea of what amount that is?
Billions.
But how many billions?
I can't pull it out of my brain.
Because I think once before you mentioned 50 billion. Actually, it's an averaging about 3 billion.
Yeah,
and most of those are just transfer of armaments that we sell, and it's not direct David. I just wanted to get an idea.
I think 3-4 millions might be correct, but what I was saying wasn't even the magnitude. I'm saying it gets the most military aid of any country.
Well, it's most of it is just transfer of sales.
Well, it's most of it. It's not just transfer of sales.
Well, but it's 3 billion. So you're roughly about 3 billion, not 50 billion.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But it pales in comparison to the 1 trillion that we spend abroad trying to get their oil.
Yes, but when people claim that so much of our U.S. budget is on military stuff, the military stuff includes stuff that we ourselves have, and then it includes money that goes to Israel, goes to God knows who else, right? So that's also part of the military budget, which David was asking about. There is a you could argue the other side totally, which is to say that the production and sales of U.S. military hardware and knowledge, we are, after all, the biggest arms merchants in the world, right? Is that correct? That gains lots of people employment, and if we would all of a sudden stop that, we would have massive unemployment in Seattle and in LA and so forth. So people argue that whether the military expenditure is part of our economy that's important versus it's not important and so forth. But the fact that we A, have our own defense system, B, put a lot of money into NATO, which is also criticized, by the way, by the right. We shouldn't be giving, NATO funds. And we do bilateral deals is a major issue for people concerned about military spending. But you're quite right, but over the years, it's a lot. By the way, it's interesting that Obama has been accused of being, this person unfriendly to Israel. In point of fact, Israel has gotten more transfer of funds during Obama than any previous administration. That's interesting because he is in bad terms with Netanyahu and blah, 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 and he's considered hostile. But actually, if you look at the figures of military assistance, other kind of assistance, and all the rest of it, Israel has done better under Obama than he had, not in terms of policy, but in terms of that, than any previous president. So, should I liberate you? That would probably be a good idea. See some of you in the fall, and thank you for coming.